Welcome back to the Reds Reset, the podcast where we dive deep into relative energy deficiency in sport, athlete fueling, performance, and the female athlete experience. This podcast is made for athletes, coaches, and every body in motion. My name is Charlotte. I'm a runner who has faced 5 stress fractures from Reds and now aims to share stories, science, and strategies so athletes can fuel strong and thrive in their sport. Today's episode is why low energy availability breaks bones and how to heal long term. If you or a teammate have faced repeated stress fractures or bone injuries, this conversation is for you. We're going to dig into why underfueling silently sabotages bone strength, what happens when hormones and bone health get out of balance, and most importantly, what recovery and long-term healing looks like. Alright, so let's start by talking about low energy availability, or LEA. At its core, LEA happens when there's a mismatch between how much energy you take in from food and how much energy you burn, not just in training, but also in daily life. So it's not only about calories for your workouts, it's about whether there's enough left over to support your body's basic needs. The International Olympic Committee's consensus statement on Reds back in 2018 defines it like this. Low energy availability occurs when your dietary energy intake, minus the energy you spend exercising, leaves your body without enough fuel to maintain health and performance. In other words, if you're underfueling or overtraining, or both, your body runs on an energy deficit, and it has to start making tough choices about what it has to prioritize. Researchers often describe energy availability in terms of numbers. It's calculated as the calories you eat minus what you burn in exercise, and then divided by your fat-free mass. Basically, that's your lean tissue. So according to Locks and colleagues, when this number falls below about 30 kilocalories per kilogram of fat-free mass per day, that's considered low energy availability. But the important part is even before you dip under that threshold, negative effects can show up, especially if this energy mismatch is continuing for weeks or months. So how do athletes end up here? Sometimes it's intentional. Maybe there's a pressure to be leaner, lighter, or to hit a certain power to weight ratio. Other times it's unintentional, like when training volume skyrockets but fueling doesn't catch up, or when athletes just don't realize how much their bodies actually need. An article from Mountjoy et al. In 2019 pointed out that disordered eating and eating disorders are really common risk factors for LEA, and then there are really practical barriers like cost of food, limited access, or simply not having enough time to eat during a packed student-athlete schedule. Here's the key point to remember. When energy availability is low, your body has to prioritize survival. That means it will always save energy for things like keeping your heart beating and your brain functioning. But the trade-off is that other systems get down-regulated, things like bone health, reproductive hormones, and your immune system. That's why athletes with Reds often see stress fractures, menstrual disturbances, frequent illness, and slower recovery. So LEA isn't just about being a little tired or not hitting a workout. It's your body sounding an alarm that it doesn't have enough fuel to keep you healthy and performing at your best. Now that we've defined low energy availability, let's talk about how it actually affects bones and why athletes in endurance and leanness focused sports are so prone to stress fractures. So first, a quick physiology refresher. Your bones are not static. So they're constantly remodeling, meaning that cells called osteoblasts build new bone, while osteoclasts break down the old bone. In a healthy body, those processes stay in balance, but when energy availability is low, the balance gets disrupted. So here's what happens under Reds. Estrogen and testosterone drop, and both of these hormones normally help protect bone and stimulate bone formation, but with lower levels, bone building slows down. At the same time, cortisol, which is a stress hormone, goes up, and it can accelerate bone breakdown. And then levels of IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor, also fall. IGF-1 is important for bone growth and repair, so without it, healing is impaired. The result of all of this is weaker bones, and over time, this shows up as a higher risk for bone stress injuries, or BSIs. Think things like stress reactions and stress fractures. Studies show that anywhere from 3 to 21% of endurance runners experience a bone stress injury in a single year, and these injuries often cluster in weight-bearing bones like the femur, tibia, navicular, because these bones take the brunt of repetitive loading during running and jumping. But here's another layer. It's not just the overall lack of energy. Research has shown that low carbohydrate availability magnifies the damage. When athletes are underfueling, carbs are usually the first to go, either unintentionally or because of diet culture that has such a heavy emphasis on high protein or taking a low carb approach. And the problem is that carbs are essential not just for fueling workouts, but also for signaling that normal bone turnover and immune function. There are several short-term studies in endurance athletes that have found that when carbohydrate intake is very low, even if the total calories are somewhat matched, markers of bone resorption go up, bone formation markers go down, and inflammation increases after exercise. One study in young women found that a low energy and low carb diet increased hepcidin levels by 264% compared to only a 69% increase when carbs were kept higher. Hepcidin is something that blocks iron absorption, which is another critical issue for endurance athletes. So in other words, low carb adds fuel to the fire for Reds, making stress fractures, immune problems, and even anemia much more likely. So when we see athletes with repeated stress fractures and low bone density or menstrual dysfunction, Reds is usually the root cause. Menstrual disturbances, especially functional hypothalamic amenorrhea, are strongly tied to chronic estrogen deficiencies, which also further accelerate bone loss. And female athletes with FHA have been shown to suffer more bone stress injuries and miss more training days compared to their peers who maintain their regular cycles. It's also important to point out a lot of what gets labeled as OTS or overtraining syndrome might actually be Reds. A recent review found that most OTS studies showed a clear sign of low energy or low carbohydrate availability. So if an athlete is fatigued, broken down, and not recovering, we should be thinking about energy first and not just training load. Bones don't just break because of bad luck. Under Reds, your body diverts energy away from bone health and towards survival. Without enough calories, and especially without enough carbs, bone turnover tilts toward breakdown, the density decreases, and repetitive stress leads to injury. So far, we've talked about how Reds sets up the conditions for bones to break down. Now let's zoom out and look at the difference between short-term and long-term consequences, because this timeline does matter. In the short term, the most obvious outcome of low energy availability is the rise of bone stress injuries, stress reactions, stress fractures, and the cycle of getting injured, recovering, then breaking down again. I can speak from experience. In the past 11 months, I have gotten 3 femoral shaft stress fractures, and I spent more than 2/3 of the year injured and not being able to run, and this cycle is vicious and it can feel never ending. I'm currently on stress fracture number 5, the 3rd of the past 11 months, and I'm wondering if this is ever going to end. These injuries don't just sideline training, they also heal more slowly under Reds because the hormones that normally promote bone repair, like estrogen and IGF-1, are suppressed. That's why athletes in a low energy state often find themselves stuck in a frustrating loop, very, very frustrating. Every time they return to sport, they get hurt again. But what about the long term? This is where things get really concerning. Bone is a living tissue, and we build the majority of our lifetime bone mass in our teens and early 20s. If that window is compromised by Reds, an athlete may never reach their peak bone mass, and that can have lifelong consequences. I think a lot about back to my high school years when I was a cross-country runner, and I think that so much of prevention for Reds should be focused on those high school athletes, because I think they're such a vulnerable population at risk, and we know that so much of our lifetime bone mass is being built in our teens and early 20s, so I really think there's a need for more education and prevention in those athletes. Research shows that athletes who underfueled during adolescence and early adulthood can end up with lower bone mineral density, sometimes crossing into osteopenia or even osteoporosis decades earlier than expected. So that means their bones are more fragile not just during sport, but during their entire lifetime. Think about this. The stress fractures of today are one problem, but the fractures in middle age or after menopause are another. Once bone mass is lost, it's extremely difficult to fully rebuild, and in some cases, the damage is irreversible. If RED-S prevents someone from reaching their peak bone mass in their youth, it's really hard to catch up later. Even for athletes who retire from their sport, a risk still persists. A history of RED-S can leave someone with a higher baseline fracture risk for the rest of their life. This isn't just about missing seasons of competition, it's about setting up your skeletal health for the next 50 years. So when coaches, parents, or athletes themselves downplay RED-S as just part of hard training, they're missing the bigger picture. Yes, stress fractures and reoccurring injuries are painful and frustrating in the moment, but the real concern is what happens long after the medals and miles are gone. A decision to chronically underfuel during sport can translate into fragile bones, fractures from everyday activities, and even a loss of independence later in life. The takeaway here is that RED-S isn't just a performance issue, it's a health issue across the lifespan. The bones you build, or fail to build, in your youth determine how strong and resilient you'll be decades down the road. So we've talked about how RED-S breaks bones and the difference between short-term and long-term consequences, but now comes the big question. How do you actually heal once you've been diagnosed with RED-S or suffered a bone stress injury? What does recovery look like, not just for the bone, but for the whole athlete? So we're going to break this down into 4 key areas: medical management, nutrition and lifestyle, training, and mental recovery. So starting off with medical perspective, the first step is often rest because bones need time to reduce loading to heal. Stress fractures unfortunately don't heal overnight. They can take weeks to months depending on the severity. Medical professionals may recommend using crutches or even a walking boot to keep the bone non-weight bearing if needed. Doctors also keep an eye on bone mineral density, often through DEXA scans. This helps measure not only where your bone density is now, but whether you're trending in the right direction during your recovery. Tracking changes gives athletes and clinicians feedback on whether fueling and training changes are actually improving the skeletal health. Moving on to nutrition and lifestyle, this is the foundation of recovery. To heal bones, the body needs consistent, adequate energy. So this means eating enough every single day, not just on workout days, not just adding a supplement here or there. Studies show that it's the overall energy balance and not just one nutrient that drives recovery. Within that, protein's also essential. The current recommendations sit around 1.6 to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight per day to support muscle and bone repair. And on top of that, micronutrients matter as well, like calcium and vitamin D, which are going to support bone mineralization, and iron is super critical for oxygen delivery and athletic performance. But again, supplements can't patch over an underfueled body, which I think is really important to stress. And it's important about eating enough, eating regularly to restore energy availability. Coming back after RED-S and bone injury doesn't mean just jumping back into mileage. In fact, cross-training often plays a huge role early on. So think cycling, swimming, pool running. Been here for many, many, many months out of the year. Spend most of my time here. But they really can help you maintain fitness without loading fragile bones. When return to run does happen, it's gradual and carefully monitored. Coaches and clinicians need to scale both volume and intensity over time. One piece that often gets overlooked is resistance training, which we now have a lot of research on how strength training work is incredibly important for bones. And loading the skeleton through resistance training helps stimulate bone remodeling and improves long-term skeletal strength, which is something endurance athletes can often miss out on. Moving on to mental recovery, finally, this might be the hardest piece because recovery isn't just about the physical, and RED-S is often, not always, but often tied to disordered eating patterns or rigid food rules. So without addressing that, the cycle is likely to repeat. And working with a sports psychologist or dietitian can help athletes rebuild a healthy relationship with food, exercise, and rest. And that's key because mental health and nutrition behaviors are just as important as physical rehab when it comes to preventing relapse. So to sum it up, healing bones after RED-S requires a multi-dimensional approach. From a medical side, there's monitoring bone density and following proper rest protocols. From a nutrition and lifestyle side, there's fueling consistently and adequately, the right mix of protein amongst carbs and fats, calcium, vitamin D, and iron. From a training perspective, easing back with cross-training and incorporating resistance work. And from a mental side, addressing the underlying behaviors that led to underfueling in the first place. The message here is hopeful. Bones can heal, athletes can return, and performance can come back, but only if energy availability is restored and maintained. Otherwise, the cycle can repeat. Raising my hand here. Recovery isn't quick or easy, but it's absolutely possible with the right support team and right mindset. I like to do my takeaways at the end of each episode, so the take-home messages for today are: fueling isn't just about performance, it's about protecting your bones for life. Stress fractures are not bad luck, they are signals of deeper imbalance. Early intervention equals better long-term bone health, and we should be encouraging athletes to seek medical and nutritional support if they suspect RED-S. That wraps up today's episode of the RED-S Reset. If today's episode resonated with you, share it with a teammate or friend who needs to hear this. And if you want more science-backed episodes and athlete stories, make sure to follow the show wherever you listen to your podcast. Thanks for being here, and remember, fueling isn't optional, it's foundational. I'll see you next time on the RED-S Reset.